never had a lot of freedom, really. Hell, I wasn't even allowed to go to the bathroom by myself until I was 8. It wasn't really my parents' fault, though. Before I was born, they had another kid, Jacob. They loved him a lot, even more than myself, I remember thinking as a kid. One day, I guess they weren't careful enough, and Jacob ended up going missing. He was only 9 years old. He simply left, never to be seen again. They gave up looking for him after 7 months, and a year later, they got pregnant with me. They never found his body, so I think a little part of them always hoped he was alive. I never met him, but I remember ever since I was little, I had felt this weird connection to him. My parents used to tell me I'd scare the hell out of them when I was younger, because I kept on talking to this one corner in the closet. Whenever they'd ask me who I was talking to, I would just say, Big Brother. Keep in mind, I was younger than 3 when this had happened. They hadn't told me about him, and there's no way I could have known otherwise. I do remember he was a part of my life. Maybe it was some subconscious trauma response to having overprotective parents, but I could have sworn he was always there, hovering over me. The first time I remember him talking to me, I was around 5. I was coloring some picture in the playroom, and Jacob was talking to me. "What are you drawing?" he asked me. He tugged on my braids. I remember he did that a lot. "It's a forest with fairies and a rainbow and a baby deer," I said proudly, holding it up to him. He scoffed. "That don't even look like a real forest. To draw nature, you gotta be in nature. Here, come with me." He took my wrist in his cold, icy hand and practically dragged me outside. He handed me a little shovel I used to help Mom in the garden. "Dig right there," he told me, and I obliged. I found the usual: bugs, rocks, roots. But I also dug up something else, and Jacob smiled as I pulled it out of the ground. It was a backpack. I think it used to be red. It felt heavy, and there was definitely something in it, but the zipper was so rusted I couldn't get it open. "That's all right," Jacob shrugged. "We'll get it later. Lily," I heard my mother's panicked voice call. Lily, she saw me outside, and Jacob quickly took the bag from me and pushed me away. "Oh my goodness, don't run off like that alone." I wasn't alone. I protested, looking back to see. Nothing. Jacob has disappeared. My mom dragged me back inside by the collar of my dress and put me in my room. "Do not leave here. You mustn't go outside like that. Stay safe." I never really liked my bedroom. Something about it was just off, even to me as a little kid. I never felt entirely alone, and there was a certain amount of bad energy that I could just feel. I especially hated the closet. Whenever I would change clothes, I'd shut my eyes, fish around until I found something. I didn't care if it was ugly. I just wanted to get out of the closet as soon as I could. All of the energy that was in the room felt like it was smothering me in there. Suddenly, Jacob appeared behind me. I jumped. He looked where I had been staring, right at the closet. "You're scared of that thing, huh, little sis?" he asked, and I nodded shakily. He glanced at me, then back at the closet. "Sometimes you need to face your fears." He very slowly paced towards the closet, then opened it in one swift movement. He motioned for me to come over. I, believing everything my big brother told me, inched towards him. "Go in." I shut my eyes and stepped in, and to my surprise, he shut the door behind me, leaving me in the scary dark closet alone. I cried for him, but he didn't respond. I curled into a little ball and cried into my knees. The feeling of dread was overpowering me. I felt so alone. It was too quiet. Not a good, peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that you can feel in your bones. Like there was someone else in the closet with me, watching me. To comfort myself, I tapped on the closet walls. One section I had noticed, sounded different than every other part of the wall, like it was hollow. I never liked that corner of the closet. It was the scariest part. Eventually, my mom called me down for dinner, and I worked up the courage to get up and open the door. Jacob wasn't there. Nobody was. That night, my parents told me to not speak about Jacob ever again. That stopped me for a while. I honestly don't remember a lot up until I was 8. I don't know if this was the first time I had spoken to him since the closet incident, but it's the most significant. This time, he took me to Dad's work computer and showed me all the fun games to play. But after a while, he told me to stop playing the silly games and start Googling things. Being a sheltered kid, I didn't even know what Google was. He told me to Google Jacob Holden. "That's you," I remember saying. I clicked on the first article I found. Jacob Holden, aged 9, went missing from his Colorado home on March 12, 2003. He leaves without a trace, the only thing missing from his room being his school backpack. Authorities have tried to reach out to his parents, Jennifer and Carl Holden, to no avail. He was not seen leaving the house and was not seen by anybody after he left school. "School backpack?" I said. "Like the one we found together?" Without a word, he handed me the old rusted-off backpack. He then handed me a pair of scissors. "Cut it open, Lily." "Please," I obliged. And inside in the backpack I had found years ago was everything. Jacob Holden, passport. Jacob Holden, birth certificate. Anything that could have identified him was in that bag. But why was it buried in our backyard? I began thinking about everything. Mom and Dad almost never let me outside alone. The backpack was buried outside with everything in it. Mom and Dad apparently never talked to the police, even though they had told me they searched for months. Jacob was never seen leaving the house. The hollow wall in my closet. I guess Jacob had realized I had known what was up, because he presented me with something. A large sledgehammer. "Go to your closet, Lily. You know what to do." With tears in my eyes, I took the sledgehammer from him and ran to my closet. I went, shaking, to the door that held my biggest fear for so long, now knowing that it was true the whole time. I found the hollow corner and let the sledgehammer loose on it. Something they don't tell you about dead bodies is, if they're trapped in an airtight space, such as a wall, they don't really decompose. They more just dry up, like meat in a dry aging fridge. Jacob's official cause of death was starvation. He was still alive when they put him in there. I didn't ever see Mom and Dad after that. Police took me to live with my aunt. I never saw Jacob either. I missed him. The last time I saw him, I was in the back of a police car, being taken to a foster home until they could find a relative who would take me in. I looked back at my house, my window, to see Jacob. He was staring at me blankly. He waved goodbye at me, and I gave him a smile. Maybe he could never leave that place, but he sure made sure I could. He was one hell of a big brother, after all. Story 2. I'm taking care of a local farm for a few weeks. They left me a strange set of rules. A few miles north of me, there's a little family-owned farm. The family takes a vacation in July, though, and they posted a job listing for a caretaker. My job would include feeding the animals, making sure the irrigation is working, and harvesting some crops. It's a small operation, so it's not fields and fields of stuff. Plus, they were offering $2,000. At the time, that seemed like an amazing deal. Now, I'm not so sure. See, the Gershons left me detailed instructions in the envelope, along with half of the stipend. And as I sat down to read it, I realized that it sounded a little strange. Dear Emily, thank you for taking care of our farm. To ensure your safety and happiness and the animals, we've included a list of instructions and tasks. 1. Please feed the goats and chickens at AM sharp. They get pretty cranky if it's not on time. 2. You will need to prune off the flora canes in the raspberry patch. To do this, cut the cane's branches that are woody and have already fruited. Wear thick gloves because there are thorns. If you do get cut, immediately head inside and call Dr. Livesey to make sure your wound is not infected. 3. The sunflower field is easy to maintain and brings beauty to our farm. However, if you ever see a sunflower that isn't facing the same direction as the others, immediately head inside. Do not return to the sunflower field until the following day. 4. The farm is, as you know, surrounded by forest. Sometimes we get coyotes, foxes, or other wild animals prowling about the grounds at night. Don't worry, the animal pens are completely secure, and there is no need to check on the animals if you hear anything at night. In fact, we recommend you do not leave the farmhouse between sunset and sunrise. 5. Do not enter the corn maze. Even if you hear noises coming from the maze that sound like a child crying, do not enter. The corn maze is not open to visitors yet. It's most likely the bobcats in the woods. 6. Do not be alarmed if you see the goats awake in the middle of the night. They are semi-nocturnal and often wake up to roam, graze, or use the bathroom. 7. You may help yourself to any of the fruits or vegetables you harvest, however. Do not eat the apples from the northwest corner of the orchard. 8. We no longer use scarecrows. If you see one, please return to the house, lock all the doors, and close all the curtains. Stay inside until the following morning. 9. Make sure to always stock the farm stand twice a day, in the morning and again in the afternoon. At night, take all unsold produce inside and store it in the refrigerator. 10. We do not own any pigs. Thank you so very much, Emily. The Gershons. I glanced out the window. The sun was hanging low over the trees, orange rays filtering through the forest. Damn it, if I'm not supposed to be out after dark because of the wolves or whatever, I better get cracking. I walked over to the goats first. They huddled close to me as I filled their food bins, staring at me with their weird slit pupils. I tried to get it done as quickly as possible. Goats, honestly, freaked me out a little bit. As I hurried away, one with black and white fur pushed its little face through the fence. "Ma," it bleated, staring at me. The chickens were more skeptical of me, staring at me and letting out long bob-wooks as they bobbed their heads. As soon as they realized I had food, though, they came over and pecked the ground. They were pretty cute, actually. I locked the gate and turned back towards the house. I froze. Across the field from me stood the field of sunflowers. Bright golden petals and dark centers, swaying slightly in the wind. But while all of them tilted away from me, facing the dying sun, one of them near the edge of the field was instead facing me. I stared at its pitch-black center. Didn't the note say something about that? Go inside if one of the sunflowers is pointing a different way? I locked up the chicken gate. Then I strode across the grass towards the old farmhouse, still carrying the bag of chicken feed. I was halfway to the house when I turned around again. I wish I hadn't. The sunflower was still facing me, even though, based on my path, it shouldn't have been. I picked up my pace towards the house. Oh, come on. What do you think's gonna happen? That sunflower is gonna chase after you and murder you? My brain knew it was stupid, but there was something instinctual, a gut feeling, that forced my legs to pump harder. I didn't even bother dropping the feed off at the shed. I raced into the house and locked all the doors. Phew, safe. I took a final glance out at the sunflower. Then I went into the tiny kitchen and started some water boiling for pasta. By the time I was sitting down to eat, I was shaking my head. So stupid. Afraid of a sunflower. Something woke me up in the middle of the night. I sat up, my neck aching from the crappy pillow they'd left for me. I looked around my tiny bedroom, but nothing seemed amiss. Well, of course, there were things amiss, like the peeling paint and the light bulb that flickered and the clogged toilet. But nothing different. I yawned and checked my phone. 3:12 a.m. Sighing, I settled back into sleep. But before I drifted off, I heard it. A small, high-pitched noise, coming from outside. I slowly forced myself out of bed and walked over to the window. Underneath me, the farm sprawled out into the darkness, but it was distorted in the old glass, shapes and colors bleeding into each other like running paint. I flipped the window lock and pushed it open, the wood squeaking loudly in my ears. I listened. Silence. Then, help me, a voice. A child's voice, coming from the direction of the cornfield. That's no fucking bobcat. My blood ran cold. I stared out into the darkness at the cornfield on the edge of the woods, hoping that it was just some lingering dream or something. But as I stood there, the cool summer breeze wafting into the room, I heard it again. Please, help me. The voice wavered, as if the child was crying. I squinted into the darkness, staring at the cornfield. I have to go out there. I remembered the Gershon's rule, but there was no way this was an animal. Hey, I'm coming, don't worry. I shouted out the window. Silence. And then a rustling sound. I squinted at the cornfield and I could see the stalks moving as something moved within them. Stay where you are. I shouted into the darkness. I'm coming to get you. The corn stalks continued to move, and every muscle in my body froze. The amount of corn moving. There was no way it was just a small child in there. The corn was swaying, dancing, roiling in an area maybe 10 feet across. And it was making its way towards the edge of the field. Rapidly. I shut the window. Then I closed the blinds, my heart hammering in my chest. I raced downstairs and checked the locks. And then, finally, when I was sure I was safe, I called the police. But they wouldn't even come out. There are no missing children in the area, and what you saw was most likely a bear, they explained calmly. I think they must know all about the Gershon's farm. So now I lie here, in my bed, listening the snaps and rustles of the cornstalks. There is a chair wedged under my doorknob. I've triple-checked all the locks. AM came all too early. The alarm blared in my ears, and I forced myself out of bed, groaning. The sun had just crested over the hill, and the sky was lit with the pale gray of dawn. I could hear the rooster crowing already. I looked out the window, scanned the farm, but everything looked normal. All the sunflowers were facing halfway towards me, in direction of the rising sun. The cornfield was still. The chickens were milling about the coop, pecking the ground. I went downstairs, grabbed the bag of feed I'd never put away, and went out to the coop. The chickens were probably the only part of the farm I liked. The fat little hens ran towards me as I poured the food onto the ground. Making happy noises, they pecked it up. I locked the gate and started over the hill, towards the shed, to get the goat feed. That's when I heard it. Oink. I stopped in my tracks. The Gershon's note said they didn't own any pigs. Oink. The note didn't say anything about avoiding the pigs, though. So I was free to go fetch the goat feed. Right? I started walking again, up the hill. Oink. And that's when I realized there was something off about the sound. It almost sounded human, like a person saying oink instead of an actual animal sound. For a second, I had a weird mental image of a naked man covered in his own filth, crouching on the ground, saying oink over and over. Oink. I shook my head and continued up the hill. And when I got to the top, I saw the source of the noise, a fat, pink pig standing in the grass. I let out a breath of relief. See? It's just an ordinary pig. I passed the pig, ignoring it completely, and opened the shed. Put the chicken feed back. Pulled out the goat feed. Started back up the hill. I stopped dead as my eyes fell on the pig. Its face. It almost looked human. Its fleshy pink snout was shorter than it should be. Its curled little ears sat low and flat on its head. And its eyes. They weren't round and beady, but almond-shaped like a person's, with dark pupils that stared up at me in a way that suggested intelligence. The feed bag fell out of my hands. I stumbled back, but the pig didn't advance. It just stared at me with its human eyes. I backed away, keeping my eyes on it, slowly walked around it so that I was going back towards the house. When I got over the hill and that horrible little face was finally out of my sight, I whipped around and broke into a run. What the fuck was that? I panted to myself as I locked the front door behind me. Not knowing what else to do, I pulled out my phone and called the police. But when they picked up, I wasn't sure what to say. I started. Found a pig that doesn't look like a pig. On the farm. The Gershon's farm. Did you touch the pig? The officer cut in. What? Did you have any contact with the pig? Any at all? No, good. We'll send an officer out to deal with it. 15 minutes later, I saw a police car pull up the driveway. They asked me where I'd seen it, then told me to stay inside. I went over to the window and watched them walk up the hill, then disappear. A minute passed. Then a shrill squeal erupted in the silence. 5 minutes later, the officers reappeared, carrying a large black plastic bag that swung with each step. Hey, hey, I called out as they headed for the cruiser. What was that thing? The officers glanced at each other. Rabies, the female officer said, while the male stuffed the bag into the back seat. A bunch of rabid pigs have been showing up in this area. Gonna send it off to get tested. Good thing you didn't touch it. Before I could ask her more questions, she hopped into the driver's side. And then they were gone. I stared out the window, utterly perplexed. Why didn't the Gershons tell me to stay away from the pigs? After the debacle with the pig, I decided to take it easy. I made a wholesome breakfast, read a few chapters of the thriller I was working through, and called my boyfriend. Around a.m., though, I realized I'd forgotten to stock the farm stand. It was still technically morning, so I ran out into the field, filled my hod with zucchini and tomatoes, and ran down the driveway as fast as I could without spilling any of the produce. But as the little farm stand came into view, I saw that there was already someone waiting. I checked my watch, 11:49 a.m. I'm so sorry, I breathed as I spread the produce out on the wooden table. I was supposed to get this out earlier, but there was a pig, and something made me stop rambling. I glanced up to see that the person standing there was a little odd. He was an old man, probably about 6 feet tall and very thin. He wore, surprisingly, a crisp black suit and an old-timey bowler hat in the sweltering heat. He was smiling at me, but his teeth were deeply yellow and crooked, and his eyes were sunken back in his skull. Nothing unnatural about him, just a slightly creepy-looking old guy, but in a way, He reminded me of the creepy dudes from that one Buffy the Vampire episode where they take away everyone's voices. "So, what are you looking for today?" I asked, when he didn't move to take any of the produce. "The Gershons aren't here?" I shook my head. "Won't be back for 2 weeks. He said thoughtfully. "They didn't tell me they were leaving. Oh, you know them?" He let out a small chuckle. "You could say that. I waited for him to either take produce or leave. But he didn't do either. He just stood there, looking at me. The way his blue eyes cut into mine made a chill run down my spine. It wasn't a predatory or sexual stare. It felt more like he was examining me, studying me, trying to read every tilt of my head and blink of my eyes. It made me extremely uncomfortable. "So, are you interested in any of this?" "The tomatoes looked really good today," I said, trying to not sound nervous. "Or if you're looking for something else, I can go pick it for you. Only the Gershons can provide what I'm looking for." "Okay, well, I'm going back up to the farm. If you change your mind, the prices are listed on the whiteboard, and you just leave the money in the box." I shot him a fake smile, turned around, and headed up the hill as quickly as I could without seeming weird. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Emily," I never told him my name. The smartest thing would have been to run. But instead, I turned around. He wasn't chasing me. He was still standing at the farm stand 10 yards from me. "I wouldn't trust the Gershons if I were you," he called out. Then he turned on his heel and strode away. As I watched him go, I realized there wasn't any car parked at the bottom of the driveway. He just turned onto the old country road and walked away. I watched him until he rounded the bend and disappeared from sight. I retreated into the house, checked all the locks, and decided I would spend the rest of the day inside at least, until it was time to feed the animals and stock the farm stand again. When I fed the goats that evening, they still seemed mad at me from the morning. With all the pig business, I hadn't gotten their morning meal to them until nearly a.m., and as I entered the pen, they eyed me warily. "Ma," a brown one bleated, with a look of betrayal in its slit pupil eyes. My last task of the day was picking up the unsold produce. I hurried down the driveway, garden hod in my arms, an audiobook playing through my earbuds. The sun hung low in the sky, casting shadows that stretched across the driveway before me. The sun wasn't setting yet. That wouldn't be for another hour, but it still made me nervous. Most of the produce was gone, but I grabbed the 3 remaining zucchini and put them in the hod. Then I turned around and hurried back up the hill as fast as I could. But when I crested the hill, I saw something in the fields that made my heart stop. A scarecrow. Its arms stretched out at its sides. Its head hung limply on its shoulders. I couldn't see it in detail. It was too far away, but I could see its silhouette clearly. I immediately broke into a sprint. "Just get inside. You'll be fine." I focused on the white door. It was still so far away, but I forced myself to stare at it, to keep my eyes away from the scarecrow. "Just run. As fast as you can." And I made it. I slammed the door shut, drew the deadbolt, closed all the curtains, checked all the other locks, and then I collapsed onto the couch and called my boyfriend, Derek. "You have to come here," I told him. "There's someone out there," and I ran inside, but I rambled on in incoherent sentences until he interrupted me. "Wait, slow down. You think there's someone out there?" "Yes, are you sure?" Derek was a good man, but he often thought I was being a little too paranoid, a little too scared. When I insisted I was being followed home from work, he told me it was probably nothing, and just some guy walking the same route as me. When I heard sounds in the middle of the night, He insisted it was the house settling. When I watched true crime shows and told him how we need to do X or Y so we don't fall victim to a crime like that, he'd just laugh. It wasn't intentionally mean, but in these moments it was painfully obvious he'd grown up as a man with little to be afraid of in this world. Yes, I'm sure. They said the farm doesn't use scarecrows, and there is a fucking scarecrow standing on the hill, watching me. I heard a loud sigh on the other end. Are you saying you don't believe me? I didn't say anything, he said calmly. You sighed, okay? Sorry. It's just, this sounds really. He trailed off. Never mind, please, just come over here. I'll explain everything. Why don't you come over here? Because if I go outside, the scarecrow will get me. Silence. And then I realized that sentence did sound pretty unhinged on its own. Listen, there's been really weird stuff happening on this farm, and then I launched into an explanation of everything. The list of rules, the sunflowers, the cornfield, even the pig man. Why didn't you tell me all this earlier? He asked when I'd finished. Because you wouldn't believe me. You still don't. I'm trying to. This sounds like a lot of ghost story type stuff, you know. Another sigh. But look, I can tell you're upset. I'm coming over, okay? I'm leaving right now. Be there in a half hour. I ended the call and stared at the curtains. For a minute, I was tempted to part them, to make sure the scarecrow hadn't gotten closer. But I wasn't going to disobey the rules. When Derek arrived, I took every precaution to get him inside safely. I told him to park as close to the house as possible, look around for scarecrows, and then run as fast as he could. As soon as he was inside safely, my fear melted away. We put on a movie, had some good laughs, and then went to bed. But around a.m., something woke me with a start. And when I sat up, I realized Derek was gone. Derek, I called out, walking into the hallway. Where are you? When he didn't reply, I walked downstairs. I found him standing in front of the window, peering outside. Hey, I hissed. You're not supposed to look outside. There's someone out there. My blood ran cold. I joined him at the window and scanned the fields. I don't see anyone. No, there was definitely someone out there. His fingers inched towards his belt, and my heart plummeted when I saw the shiny black metal sticking out of his pocket. You brought your gun? You said you were scared. He whispered back. You said someone was out there. I didn't really believe you, but now I do. Aren't you glad I brought it? No, I never want to be near that thing, okay? We can have some stupid debate about gun rights later. Right now, there's someone out there. And if we just go back to sleep, we might not wake up in the morning. Derek, I'm just telling it like it is. I crossed my arms and stared out into the fields with him. And then just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A shadowy figure walking along the edge of the sunflower field. Derek didn't waste any time. He unbolted the door and swung it open. Hey, you, get off our property. I've got a gun. The figure stopped, paused, and then sidestepped into the sunflowers. Before I could stop him, Derek ran out of the house. Derek, I shouted, but he didn't stop. I paused at the threshold, and then I sprinted out after him. Come back. Fuck. He was running straight for the sunflower field. Don't go in there. He probably wouldn't have even stopped. But when he got to the border, I screamed bloody murder at him, and he stopped for just a moment. You can't go in there, I panted, grabbing his arm. The sunflowers. Yeah, you told me they're evil or watch you or something. I think I can handle myself. He gestured to his gun. And if I don't scare this fucker, he's going to come back and rape or murder or do whatever he came here to do. With that, he disappeared into the foliage. I stood there, panting, at the border of the field. He'll be okay, I lied to myself. He'll be okay. As the adrenaline faded, I lifted my head and scanned the flowers. They were all turned towards me, yellow petals appearing silver in the light of the full moon. Okay? It's okay. They're all pointing the same direction. See? Wait. There was a single flower in the center of the field, turned away from me. My blood ran cold. Derek, come out of there. Silence. No pounding footsteps, no rustling, nothing. A chill ran over my body. Please, come out, I begged, staring into the shadowy darkness under the flowers. And then I heard it. Help, Derek's voice. Strangled in pain. I reacted instinctively. My feet hit the dirt and I stumbled into the darkness. Leaves brushed my body, scratched at my arms. Derek, I called. The sunflowers stretched up, 6 or 7 feet tall, their moonlit heads swaying in the breeze above me. I turned a full circle looking in every direction for Derek, but all I saw were more stems, more leaves, more inky black shadows. Derek, where are you? I stopped walking and listened, straining my ears for any sort of sound. And then, after several seconds, I heard something, a soft rustling. There was just one problem. It was coming from right above my head. I looked up. The sunflower directly above me was tilted straight down. And this close, I saw it clearly. Its head wasn't full of seeds, no. Where the seeds should have been, there was just an abyss of pure black. And there were things between the petals and the abyss white, sharp things, all pointed towards the center. Teeth. I broke into a sprint. With both arms, I pushed the sunflowers out of the way, forcing myself through the field. Derek, I screamed, but all I heard was more rustling above my head. As all the sunflowers tilted towards me, as their mouths opened and rows of sharp fangs, gleaming in the moonlight, descended towards me. Then something grabbed my arm. I was dragged through the fields, the foliage snapping and rustling underneath me. Help, I screamed, but as my legs kicked against the dirt, I realized I was powerless. As I was dragged to my death, I was staring up at the stars. I shot up. The thing clasped around my arm wasn't a sunflower, it was a hand. An old, wrinkled hand. I looked up to see a bowler hat and a dark suit. The old man from the farm stand. And there, several feet away from me in the dirt, was Derek. He was breathing hard, alive, but his right arm was covered in dark blood that spilled out into the soil. I think it's time we had a talk, he said calmly as he let go of my arm. What were you thinking going into the sunflowers? The old man asked as he wound gauze around Derek's arm. What were you thinking? I saw you go into the field too, he replied. I went behind the field. To hide from the crazy man with a gun. You were lurking around out there at AM. What was I supposed to think? Derek shot back, grimacing in pain. And you, the old man said, pointing squarely at me. You should have known that if he couldn't kill whatever was attacking him with a gun, going in after him was an idiot move. I wanted to save him, I said, arms crossed. Oh, so you were armed too? No, he shook his head. I caught the phrase stupid kids muttered under his breath. Then he took off his hat, set it in the middle of the table, and glanced at each of us. I'm going to tell you what's going on here. And then I hope you can help me. Derek and I exchanged a glance. How do we know we can trust you? He asked. He just saved our lives, I replied. He was hanging around outside in the middle of the night, for no good reason. It was a good reason. The old man snapped, glaring at Derek. And if you just listened to me for a damn minute, you'd understand. Come on, I whispered, squeezing Derek's hand. Okay, fine. The old man straightened himself, and then began to speak. The Gershons started this farm almost 20 years ago. They bought the plot of land from an old widow who had lived here her entire life. She didn't want to sell it, but she needed the money. Well, they drew up the contract, but at the last moment, they changed the paperwork and tricked her into selling it for half the price. When she realized she'd been tricked, she cursed the land itself. But they just laughed. They didn't believe in curses or superstitions or the supernatural. The old man stopped and looked pointedly at Derek. He broke eye contact and looked at the floor. Of course, as soon as they planted the sunflower field, they realized the curse was very real. Eventually, they tried to sell the property, but by that time, news of the curse had spread, and they would only get a fraction of what they paid. They weren't willing to lose their money, so they kept it. And with time, they learned that if they followed certain rules and stayed careful, they could grow some crops and turn a profit. But no one is perfect. After some close calls, the Gershons decided they didn't want to risk their lives, but were perfectly fine with risking other people's lives. So they started hiring people to tend to the farm. They preyed on the weak, the disadvantaged, the desperate. Single mothers, undocumented immigrants, people who were new to the town, who hadn't yet heard of the curse or were too desperate to care. The deal was a good one, too. A share of the crops, a place to live, and decent pay. This is where I come in. My daughter was one of these people. She was a single mother. And I was terrible. He paused and swallowed, as if swallowing emotion. But his face remained stoic. I wouldn't let her and her son stay with me when she was evicted from her apartment. I thought it would cause too much conflict with my wife, and I was trying so hard to make it work. But now I see that none of that mattered. He sucked in a breath. A few weeks later, she was hired by the Gershons, and neither she nor my grandson were ever seen again. Derek and I sat there in stunned silence. I'm so sorry, I finally choked out. That's horrible. Then help me get them back, he said, a pleading look in his eye. Get them back? They're not dead. You see, I recognize the voice in the cornfield. It's the voice of my grandson. Silence fell over the three of us. Derek and I looked at each other. The old man must have noticed our confusion, because he continued, the victims aren't always killed. Sometimes they're transformed, like my daughter and grandson in the cornfield, or the scarecrow, or the pigs. I clapped my hands over my mouth. The pigs? He nodded. No, 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 I called the police when I saw one. And they came, and I think tears burned my eyes. I think they killed him. I'm so sorry to hear that. But it's not your fault. The Gershons have a lot of power in this town. They have a deal with the police. Dirty cops have been known to get rid of evidence in the sunflower field. He sighed. I've devoted the past 3 years of my life to this. I've run into every obstacle, know everything there is to know. A lot of it I learned from the widow's children directly. So is there a way to get them back? The people who were transformed? I asked. Yes. I was never able to get into the house before the Gershons made sure of that. But now, he reached into his pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a small mesh bag. Within, among what looked like dried plant material, I could make out something long and white a bone. This is what the widow used to create the curse. Her daughter told me it was hidden behind the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, And there it was. Using this, I should be able to reverse the curse's effects. He glanced at Derek, and then back at me. So, will you help me? I paused, looking into the old man's blue eyes. And then I nodded. We began at dawn. The sun crested over the hill, sending long shadows over the path. The old man led us to the edge of the cornfield, which now in the daylight didn't look so ominous. The stalks swayed gently in the breeze, illuminated in gold from the rising sun. "Are you ready?" he asked. Derek and I stood several feet away as he lifted the bag. He recited several sentences of Latin or some other language, something he'd memorized in his research, I assumed. He nearly shouted the last sentence. Then he dumped the contents of the bag on the ground. The dried leaves scattered in the wind. The bone twirled in the air, then bounced into the dirt. For a minute, nothing happened. But then I heard it, a soft rustling from within the corn. Slowly, it grew louder and louder. I grabbed Derek's hand and squeezed it, bracing myself for some eldritch horror to come out, but it had worked. A woman walked out of the corn, tall and thin, holding hands with a smiling little boy. I watched, my eyes welling up with tears, as the woman hugged her father. Then as both of them hugged the little boy. "Come on," the old man said, wiping his eyes. "It's time for you to come home." The old man started down the driveway, towards the main road, with his daughter and his grandson in his wake. Dread twisted my gut. Something felt off. He was just leaving, without looking for the others, without even a glance in our direction. I scanned the farm, but I didn't see anyone emerging, didn't hear any voices. "Hey," I called out. "What about the others?" The old man stopped and turned around. He wasn't smiling. "I'm sorry," he said. My heart sunk further. "What do you mean you're sorry?" "The curse can't be reversed," he said, his blue eyes glinting in the rising sun. "The only way to free someone from the farm is to give someone in their place." No, he doesn't mean I'm sorry," the old man said. He put his arm around his daughter. She looked back at us with sadness in her eyes, holding her little boy's hand. And then he continued down the driveway. "Don't walk away," I screamed. "Emily," Derek started. "Come back here. Right now." "Emily," this time, Derek's voice had an odd quality to it. It was muffled, raspy. I whipped around and froze. Straw was poking out of Derek's mouth. "No," I screamed, stumbling over to him. But it was too late. His skin was sickly gray. His eyes were glassy and blank. And his lips, they almost looked like they'd been drawn on with marker. I watched in horror as the man I loved turned into a scarecrow. "Derek," I sobbed. "Please," his body was still above me. Arms stretched stiffly out at his sides. Flannel shirt stuffed with straw. Burlap head hanging limply on his shoulders. And then he moved. His head swung wildly towards me. His eyes now nothing more than buttons fixed squarely on me. I ran. I ran as fast as I could towards the house. But I could feel something changing inside me. Everything felt off balance. My legs felt all wrong, bending and twisting underneath me. I stumbled inside and collapsed to the floor, crying. But I knew I was changing too. For some reason, my changes are happening more slowly than Derek's. But when I look in the mirror, I can see the changes. My nose is longer. My ears are twisted. My skin is pinker. So I tried to type this up as quickly as I could. "Please, stay far away from Gershon Farm. Don't buy their stuff. Don't go to work there. Don't do anything. Run as fast as you can and never look back." I would say more, but it's getting harder to type. The space between my fingers is melting away. My hands are growing stiff. In just an hour or so, they will be hooves, and I will have no way of communicating with the outside world. So please, whatever you do, don't come to Gershon Farm. Story 3. A brain injury let me see the real world. I don't like it. Two years ago, I died. It was nothing special. A car accident. People die all the time in car crashes. I was on my way home from work, pulling out onto the motorway, and a truck was going too fast. I know exactly what happened, because my lawyer showed me the truck's dashcam footage. My car spun out, then flipped over. The roof buckled and hit my head. Both my lungs were punctured. My legs were broken. Half my ribs were cracked. I was unconscious, barely alive, when the paramedics arrived. I was in the operating theater for 16 hours, and in that time, I died for 95 seconds. Miraculously, the surgeons saved my life. I was in a coma for 8 months. They thought I'd never wake up, but somehow I did. First, they said I'd never survive. Then they said I'd never wake up. Then they said I had irreparable brain damage. Then they said I'd never walk again. Time after time, I beat the odds. The brain is a funny thing. I should know I'm a neuroscientist. I'm not a doctor or a brain surgeon. I do research, fMRI scans, that sort of thing. That evening, I'd been driving home from a day of interviewing people with synesthesia. That's where your senses mix with each other. You can smell sounds or taste colors. We were testing the hypothesis that people who claim to see auras are actually synesthetes. They see a person's mood through their facial expressions and body language, and their brain interprets that by overlaying colors around them. I don't know if it's true. There's a long way to go before we're ready to publish. This is to say that when I eventually persuaded the hospital to discharge me, still with a walking cane and occasional dizzy spells, I had a pretty good idea of what to expect. That still didn't prepare me for the actual experience. I'd get used to the white walls and the beeping machines of a few hospital rooms. The taxi journey home was overwhelming, made worse by arriving back to an empty house with no food and hardly any furniture. You know the bit in the wedding vows about "till death do us part"? Turns out, my wife had figured that 95 seconds of death still counted. She'd moved on to another guy during my 8-month vacation. I'm sure she was delighted that I was finally able to consent to selling our house. With my savings, sick pay, state benefits, and my share from the sale, I was at least able to rent a small flat. I even found a nurse, Onita, who specialized in both physiotherapy and mental health, and visited 3 times a week to check up on me, helping me with the basics while I got back on my feet. Early on, I was sleeping 18 hours a day and was overwhelmed if I spent more than a few minutes outside. Thank goodness for Deliveroo. Over several months, I gradually recovered. I was able to walk around my apartment without holding on to the walls, and even went out shopping with Anita and then later without her. Eventually, I convinced her to take me back into work, just for a day. I was still employed there and hoped to go back part-time soon. Now the thing with being a neuroscientist is you have easy access to brain scanners. We'd all scanned our brains a few times, and I even have a picture of my brain scan above my work desk at home. My ex-wife was at least kind enough to pack my things neatly. So one of the first things I did after checking that they hadn't ditched my coffee mug was get a new scan. Do you know what the amygdala is? It's a pair of tiny nuggets of brain tissue, each about the shape and size of an almond. It's really important in regulating emotions, among many other things. Your brain takes in a huge amount of data, far too much to process, and your amygdala acts as a sort of pattern-matching algorithm and filter. To massively oversimplify my 2 decades of experience, there are 3 things the amygdala does when it receives data. If it perceives threatening or overwhelming stimuli, it sends you into fight or flight or freeze mode. Your limbic system takes over, and you act emotionally rather than rationally. If it detects a familiar pattern of stimuli, it invokes the part of your brain that knows how to deal with the situation at hand. This basically sends you into autopilot, and it's why you can drive to work with no real memory of the journey. And if it detects an unfamiliar but non-threatening event, it rallies your frontal lobe. This is the rational, thinking brain, and it's how we're able to learn new skills like calculus or the piano. The amygdala does a lot of filtering before actually passing along the data it decides is relevant. I've viewed images of healthy brains countless times. I've also studied plenty of brains with damage to the amygdala. I've never before seen an amygdala that looked like mine post-crash. It certainly explained why I was still having headaches and dizzy spells. To be honest, I was worse than the doctors realized, but being a neuroscientist, I knew what lies to tell them to keep them off my back. Truth is, I could barely even focus, visually or mentally, for more than about half an hour. And now I knew why. As best I could tell, the pattern-matching role of my amygdala was functioning perfectly. The filter wasn't. The effects of this were reduced somewhat due to very high doses of psychostimulants to keep my frontal cortex active, and antipsychotics to help me moderate my emotions and reduce mental agitation. Essentially, this combination of medication seemed at least partially effective in moderating my brain function in the ways my amygdala was no longer capable of doing. But these are powerful drugs, and long-term use could cause even more brain damage, so I was coming off them. Slowly, but faster than my doctors would have let me if I'd been honest about my symptoms. I can tell you when it started, or at least when I first noticed it. My drugs were down to 50%, and Anita only came round once a week, so it was a Thursday. She rang the bell as normal. I opened the door as normal. She walked in as normal, with a maggot on her right cheek. You've got something on your cheek, I said, watching the 3 cm gray larva wriggle slightly. Oh, Anita said, almost disinterested, and wiped her face. All she managed to do was move it slightly to the side. And then, most disturbingly, she checked in the mirror in my hall, looked satisfied, and proceeded to carry out her usual checks on me. Let me tell you, that was an uncomfortable exam. The whole time I was staring at the thing, waiting for it to inevitably fall onto me. She just acted as though it wasn't even there. Half an hour later, she'd finished her tests. I was coming along nicely, she told me, although my eyes were a little dilated. I didn't tell her that hers would be too, if she'd spent 30 minutes watching a maggot crawl on somebody's face. I could have shrugged that off, especially as nothing happened for the rest of the day, and I mean nothing. 10 hours awake followed by half an hour of focused social interaction, even though I was recovering, that took it out of me, and I went to bed, as I usually did after her visits. On Friday morning, I decided I wanted a change from my usual food. A local shop was just 10 minutes walk away, so I headed out. I wanted cereal and fruit. As I entered the shop, I braced myself for the loud bell that rang when you opened the door, something that used to annoy me even before I fucked my amygdala. I didn't brace for the smell. Something putrid assailed my nostrils the moment the door opened. I gagged, spent a moment composing myself, and walked to the cereal shelves. That was fine. I grabbed a box of Frosties. Then I headed to the fruit section and found the source of the smell. The fruit was rotten. Gray and green mold covered every fruit in there. The bananas were black and mushy, at least I think they were mushy. I didn't dare touch them. Helen, I called to the woman on the counter. Helen, what's up with the fruit? Helen looked over at me. What do you mean? It's rotten. Helen walked out to me and inspected the shelves. She picked up a few blobs from behind a handwritten sign that insisted they were apples. Turning them over in her hands one by one, she eventually picked out two that looked no better or worse than the rest. Yeah, I'll chuck these. Bring whatever you want to the counter. I'll check them for you. I only bought the cereal. I stayed in for the next few days. I could focus enough to read neuroscience papers for a couple of hours a day, broken up into short stints. Meanwhile, I made a valiant attempt to catch up on my Netflix backlog, which had been bad even before my time out from life. Nothing with subtitles, though. I couldn't quite cope with those yet. As Thursday approached, I found myself getting worried. Last week had been pretty awful, and I dreaded a repeat. Anita rang the bell just after noon, and I opened the door to her. There were no maggots. I mean, you've got to try to find the positives in life, right? Anita's clothes, usually the light blue NHS uniform, were dark and ragged. She looked like she had been dragged through a bush. But that wasn't the worst of it. She had, well, it's hard to say. It was like an outline, a sort of fuzzy black shadow surrounding her. Like I said before, I've done work on the purported phenomenon of auras, and I'd read and heard plenty of first-hand reports. This shadow looked sort of like those, but I've never heard others talk of the dread I felt emanating from this nurse. I started to tell Anita I wasn't feeling well. She walked in anyway. This will only take a few minutes. And if you're not feeling well, it's all the more important I do a proper checkup. I really wish I could say that half hour was the most stressful time of my life. Anita didn't do anything unusual. She took my biometrics just as before and left. All that time, though, I was watching the shadow shift and pulsate around her. This was enough time for me to make some good scientific observations. The pulsations were roughly in time with the heartbeat, but not mine, which was racing. I can only assume they were in time with hers. I watched as parts of it flipped out into little tendrils, flailing in the air. They felt cold when they touched me. After she left, still cheerful as always, I retreated to my bedroom. I put on some Netflix junk, but I wasn't really watching it. I have always had a scientific mind, and in the worrying I did, a plan started to form. I didn't leave the house for days. I read all I could about auras, the scientific papers, the spiritual stuff I've always assumed was bunk everything. I read about the side effects of my medication and the reported effects of the specific combination very little. And I came up with an idea. What if my specific biology, my specific injuries, and these specific medications had an unusual effect? So I came off the medication. I was already on half doses. I spent 2 days on a quarter, 2 days on an eighth, and then nothing. I didn't check with the doctors as I already knew what they'd say. This did my headaches no good, but ordinary paracetamol helped. A couple of weeks later, after suffering through 2 more visits from Anita, I left the house. This was last Wednesday. It was early afternoon, fairly quiet with nobody around. I could see the familiar houses, a few trees, street furniture, the usual things you see on any residential street. But they were far from ordinary. The trees were rotten. The few leaves that remained were wilted and covered in fungus. Trunks and branches were split open, horrible mushroom-like things sprouting from their insides. I couldn't tell if the trees were dead, but they were far from healthy. Road signs were faded and rusting, and the road itself was degraded, covered in cracks and potholes filled with some sort of liquid. Like mud, but it looked slimy. I definitely didn't want to test this by touching it. The houses were decrepit. Many looked like they were about to fall down, and one with a "To Let" sign outside it actually had its roof caved in. One house was freshly painted, and the incongruity between the almost collapsed structure of the house and the clean paint made my head hurt. But even then, the paint was already starting to peel. If it wasn't for the fresh paint, the scene in front of me could have easily been mistaken for an abandoned street in a post-apocalyptic movie. A thought occurred to me. I went back inside, got my phone, and took a photo of the street. Looking at the photo on the screen of my phone, everything looked normal. I stood there for a long time, comparing what the phone saw and what my eyes saw. One of them was lying to me, but which one? I turned around, headed back into my house, which I now saw had crumbling walls and moss growing out of a multitude of spiderweb-like cracks, and pondered the question. Our brains are extremely powerful, capable of processing far more information than a phone camera. I believe our eyes see the world as it is, and our brain filters the input to present us with the accepted version of the world. I can no longer do that. The very particular brain damage I sustained would normally have killed a human. I could very well be the first person to suffer this specific damage, and be unlucky enough to survive with the rest of my mental faculties intact. Perhaps there were a few others like me, consigned to psychiatric institutions somewhere. I determined right there and then that I would not let myself suffer such incarceration. I'm a scientist. I experiment, observe, collect data. So that's exactly what I did. That afternoon, I took my phone, a notebook and clipboard, and walked into town. Without the drugs helping with the filtering my amygdala used to do, I could see the real world more clearly than 2 weeks earlier. I passed a few people on the way to the shopping center. They were all surrounded by those shadowy auras, and now I could make out more definition. The auras were roughly human-shaped, covering them all over like a spacesuit, but the shape fluctuated. From the other side of the street, I didn't want to get too close. I could make out dark, translucent tendrils coming off of the auras. But the more I looked, the more I realized they were, mostly not coming out of the people, but going into them. When I reached the shopping center, I sat down on a rarely used bench, close enough to observe people yet far enough away that few would pass near me. At lunch, people would sit on it to eat their sandwiches, but it was now nearly 4:00. I made a mental note to leave before 5 to avoid the crowds. I took a few photos, but they all came out normal. My camera wasn't going to help, so instead I sketched people. I took an evening class on sketching a few years back, so I was adequately skilled. After 5 or 6 sketches, I looked back at the pictures, trying to discern any patterns. The tendrils were worming their way into people's bodies all over, but they were much more focused on the heart and the head, the source of blood and the source of our thinking. This was early April, and I'd been surprised by the number of FLIs buzzing around the people I sketched, but hadn't really taken much notice of them. Right then, I didn't think they were significant. I moved on to drawing the dilapidated buildings, the location of moss and mold on the road, and the abysmal state of the cars that passed by. Around 3:30, I got up and walked home. The shopping center is due west of my house, so I'd had the sun in my eyes for the walk there. It was therefore something of a surprise to see the sun on my walk back. Actually, it wasn't the sun. Not the sun I'm used to anyway. About half the size and red. I turned back. Our usual yellow sun was in its proper place. If I'd seen this in the past, I'd have been shocked and bewildered. That day, it was just another bit of weirdness. Had it always been there, and I'd just never seen it before? I sketched the 2 suns, and managed to make it the rest of the way home without any further strange things happening to me. The inside of my flat was a welcome change from the weird, rotting world outside. It's only a bedroom, living room, kitchen, and bathroom, and I'd kept up with the cleaning of one person's mess easily during the last few months. Even so, I could now see the mold and damp patches on the walls, the rotting wood of the furniture, and strange cracks along the plaster. The kitchen stank, so I threw away the copious amounts of moldy food and ordered home delivery of a load of canned and ultra-processed food, as well as lots of bottled water. The tap water was brackish and tinted brown. Anita arrived right on schedule the next day. I don't know if the shadowy aura was stronger, or if I was just seeing it more clearly now. I counted 3 maggots, 1 on her face and 2 on her hair. FLIs buzzed around her, and as she poked and prodded I kept my eyes closed, grateful only for the fact that she wore sterile gloves for the examination. After 20 minutes trying not to gag due to the stench, she told me I seemed physically fine, but emotionally agitated. No shit, I thought to myself. Anita arranged an inpatient appointment for the next week. I agreed just to get her to finish and leave, with no intention of actually going. TV is good. Whatever things look like in reality apparently doesn't show up on camera. I spent the rest of the day binge-watching Netflix and YouTube, just to experience some semblance of normality. The next day, I made an appointment with the doctor. If I'd been taking my meds as prescribed, I would have been out that day. And it's amazing how quickly you can get an appointment when you claim your antipsychotics have run out. I drove to the GP surgery in the light of 2 suns, stayed in my car until the very last moment, and then went in. My doctor was running on time, hooray. And I was ushered into his office by a receptionist with skin barely clinging onto their face. I sat down opposite a short, white, balding man in a white coat, or at least, I think it was supposed to be white. The stains made it difficult to be sure. I wondered if it had been months since he had washed it, or if it had picked up all that filth in just a day or 2. The doctor asked me the usual questions, and I answered them. But a refill of my medication wasn't the reason I was there. I wanted to study another person up close, and no longer felt like I trusted Anita. Also, I felt safer outside of my home, somewhere I could flee from if necessary. He had the usual aura I'd come to expect, and I watched as the tendrils snaked about him, occasionally burrowing into his skin, as though it wasn't there. The skin was blemished and scarred in ways I hadn't seen before, and his face bled from 2 open sores. Several FLIs buzzed around him, dipping into and out of the aura and dragging it around with them. After satisfying himself with the answers to my questions, the doctor had to do a bit of work on the computer. I noticed that the FLIs were unusual, and took this opportunity to get my notebook out and sketch one of them. They were big, far bigger than any FLIs I've seen before, at 4 or 5 centimeters across. And the more I looked, the more they didn't quite look like FLIs. I studied them and completed a quick rough sketch that I could improve on later. They had black bodies with green stripes and 4 wings, so they weren't true FLIs. Some other sort of insect. I'm not much of an entomologist, but I know that insects all have 6 legs. These had 4 legs, and rather than compound eyes, they seemed to have 2 orb-like eyes on the end of stalks. This wasn't a combination I knew from any species. I was becoming more and more unnerved, and then I realized they do in fact have 6 limbs, 4 legs, and 2 grasping limbs at the front. These things are capable of holding small objects. But what really threw me, what led me to running out of the doctor's office without a prescription, was what happened next. 2 of the FLIs landed on my notebook. They seemed to study the sketch I had made. Then they started buzzing. Or to be more precise, they'd been buzzing all along. Now they buzzed in what, to me, sounded a lot like communication. Insect buzzing comes from the wings flapping in flight, but I heard it even from the 2 that weren't flying. Then they rose up, joining the other FLIs. 10 or 11 of them, I think, hovering half a meter from my face, and all looking at me and buzzing to each other. They'd been content to ignore me until then, but now they knew that I could see them. I ran, without a word, to my doctor. I got to my car and drove as fast as I could back home, not looking back to see if they were following. I reached my flat, raced inside, and started covering any hole they could possibly get through. Clothes against the doorframe, duct tape across the air vents, anything I could to seal myself in. Now, when a person runs out of their doctor's surgery in terror, it's normal to do some follow-up. When they're not taking their antipsychotic medication, it turns out the follow-up is with the police. 2 hours later, the cops turned up at my door, asking if I was okay. I hadn't done anything illegal except possibly speeding on the way home, so I spoke to them through the glass of the window of my living room. I convinced them that I wasn't in immediate danger to myself or others, and eventually they left to make their report. Their FLIs did not. A dozen or so FLIs, buzzing against my window. They dragged the shadow aura with them, tracing thick lines of it through the air as they flew. I saw some of them disappear, and assumed at first that they were trying to find another way in. No such luck. Shortly after they left, 100 more turned up, and this, I fear, is where my story ends. My food and water delivery should last me a week, maybe 2. I live almost entirely in my bedroom now, venturing out only to use the toilet and to secure the gaps where the FLIs have been trying to tunnel in. Between the FLIs and their shadow trails, I can barely see anything outside, apart from the yellow light filtering through in the daytime and the red light of the evening sun. I can barely sleep, partly because I live in constant fear, and partly because the buzzing of thousands, tens of thousands of FLIs is overwhelming. So with nothing else to do, I'm posting my account to the internet, as if that will do any good. The best I can hope for now is that I run out of food and starve to death. I don't want to know what happens to me if they get in while I'm still alive.